Hello everybody, welcome to Church History Insights and Questions. David Eaton here. This is the fourth I think, episode of Church History Insights and Questions. This one is on church finances. Let's just get that up here. And before we get into church finances, which is a huge topic, I just want to go back on the episode last time, which was on temple ordinances. And you may remember that we were talking about the endowment, and we were reading Brigham Young's statement, which appears in the endowment ceremony. I'm just going to read that again. Your endowment is to receive all those ordinances in the house of the Lord which are necessary for you after you have departed this life, to enable you to walk to the presence of the Father, passing the angels who stand as sentinels, being enabled to give them the key words, the signs and tokens pertaining to the holy priesthood, and gain your eternal exaltation in spite of earth and hell. And that's taken from Brigham Young Journal of Discourses. So I got a question came in after that episode, and here it is. The question is, why are the sentinels necessary, David? Well, I don't really know. So I looked up as much as I could. I couldn't really find very much on this, but I'm going to refer to the writings of John D. Charles in a 2004 publication called Endowed from on High, Understanding the Symbols of the Endowment. Let me just read what he says. Note the image that President Young paints. After we have departed from this life, presumably after we have been resurrected, we must physically walk back to God's presence. On the way, we will be met by God's, quote, angels who stand as sentinels. To pass these guards, we must show that we are authorized to live with God by presenting certain celestial passwords, what President Young calls keywords, signs and tokens. Only after we have given these passwords and signs will the sentinels allow us into God's presence, where we will be exalted. The purpose of the endowment, President Young says, is to teach us those passwords. This chap, John D. Charles, goes on to say, once we grasp this image, it becomes clear why the endowment is so important. Throughout the scriptures and every time we receive a gospel ordinance such as baptism, God promises that he will allow the faithful to live in his presence. It is during the endowment that the faithful learn at a very practical level how to get there. The image of passing an angel guard to enter into God's presence is not President Young's alone. It is found in the scriptures as well. In the Doctrine and Covenants 132:19, we read that those who keep the new and everlasting covenant of marriage will not only have their marriage in full force after the resurrection, but will also pass by the angels and the gods which are set there to their exaltation and glory in all things. The image of the angelic sentinels contains an echo of the image of the cherubim with the flaming sword who guarded the way of the tree of life after Adam and Eve were driven from the Garden of Eden. A shadow of the same image remains in the popular conception of St. Peter standing guard at the pearly gates. End of quote from John D. Charles. So I don't know whether that answers the question to your satisfaction or fully, but there is an answer. Let's move on then to church finances, and one of the questions we're going to look at initially is, how was the church organized according to the law? Now, You see here, this is a drawing of the old state capitol in Albany, New York. And this building housed the state government from 1812 to 1878. So it would have been to this establishment that Joseph Smith and others would have sought the necessary authority to organize the church according to the law. Now, this is taken from a book called Established Agreeable to the Laws of Our Country, and it was written by Nathan Oman, who is the Rollins Professor of Law at William & Mary Law School. I quote quite extensively from this book today, and he says at this point, quote, although in 1830 the historical record shows there was intent to incorporate the new church under New York law, there is no actual record of it taking place. So in New York, it's uncertain how the church was legally organized. We moved to Kirtland, Ohio in 1831. The church moved to Kirtland, Ohio. Later, in 1834, the Latter-day Saints acquired the property on which the temple was to be built through a confused series of transactions, which included the execution of a deed in May 1834 by John and Elsie Johnson, a Latter-day Saints couple, conveying the temple site to Joseph Smith as president of the Church of Christ. And Nathan Oman comments in quotes here, in effect, Ohio law meant that property held in trust for an otherwise unincorporated religious society would be treated as though it were held by a corporation. In Ohio, rather than using the legal regime created by the first disestablishment, the Latter-day Saints tried to use and sanctify the legal mechanisms of commerce, the business partnership, the banking corporation, and the joint stock company, close quote. The most important manifestation of the church's legal personality in Ohio were a business partnership and a bank rather than a religious corporation. So as this goes on a little further into this episode, we'll see that business partnerships, banks and religious corporations feature quite prominently. Open quote, the business partnership was called the United Firm. In New York, Joseph Smith had already revealed a preference for pursuing religious missions outside of religious corporate law when he formed a business partnership with Martin Harris to publish the Book of Mormon. Smith massively expanded this model in Ohio, forming a partnership with the leaders of the nascent church that encompassed 3 firms. The first of these centered on the Newell K. Whitney store in Kirtland and focused on the economic development of the town for the benefit of the Latter-day Saints. The second firm was located in Jackson County, Missouri, and served similar purposes. And finally, the literary firm was devoted to the publication of church newspapers and a collection of Smith's revelations. At the time, neither Ohio nor Missouri law allowed for general incorporation of business enterprises. So as a legal matter, these firms were part of a single general partnership. End of quote. In early January 1837, the Kirtland Safety Society opened for business and began issuing notes through loans or in exchange for the notes of other banks. The notes then functioned as currency. Through its agents and other business arrangements, the society tried in the following months to introduce notes into circulation across northern Ohio and in parts of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and New York. Because the name and organization of the Safety Society changed on the 2nd of January 1837, the first notes it issued were modified. And you can see here on this second banknote, the $3 one at the bottom, you can see that the characters ANTI, anti, and ING co were added. They were hand-stamped onto the original printed notes to reflect the institution's revised title. So although they had petitioned to have the bank opened, that petition was denied and they had to refer to it as an anti-banking company. The Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company. No extant notes bear dates after the 20th of July 1837, and the institution soon closed, likely by August 1837. And as we know, when the Kirtland Safety Society Bank or anti-bank closed, it caused a great deal of unrest and upset in Kirtland. It was apparently the cause of many people deciding to break away from Joseph Smith. And the context of this is that although the Kirtland Safety Society Bank closed, it wasn't the only one. There were many in that downturn in 1837. Many banks were closed. In Missouri, the church had no legal personality for the simple reason that the Missouri Constitution explicitly provided that, quote, no religious corporation can ever be established in this state, close quote. We're going back to Nathan B. Oman's comments here, and he says, during the final stages of their Missouri sojourn, the Latter-day Saints sought to acquire title to land by settling on public land and making improvements. Technically, they were squatters, but following a well-established American pattern, they expected the federal government to pass a preemption statute that would allow them to purchase the public land at favorable prices because of their improvements. Indeed, Nathan Oman goes on to say, indeed, one of the factors motivating those who ultimately drove the Saints from northern Missouri was a desire to take possession of improved Latter-day Saints land and thereby acquire the favorable preemption rights, something that the leaders of the mob that drove out the Mormons were ultimately able to do, close quote. Now, the Latter-day Saints moved, as you know, from Missouri to Illinois, and they arrived in Illinois in 1839 as refugees from Missouri. Eventually, they settled on the tiny village of Commerce, Illinois, as their gathering place. Renamed Nauvoo, it would be the headquarters of the church until the Saints abandoned the city in 1846. Oman goes on to say, quote, in contrast to Missouri, the Mormons acquired their real property in Illinois by purchase. They bought large tracts of land on and near Nauvoo on credit, mainly from land speculators. These large lots of land were then to be subdivided into small parcels and sold to the gathering saints so that the original debt could be repaid. The purchases were made through agents acting on behalf of the church. The church, however, lacked any legal existence under Illinois law, and eventually much of this property was titled in the name of Joseph Smith, who found himself exposed to massive liability on the debt used to purchase the land. Beginning in 1840, the leaders of the church made efforts to create a more formal legal existence for the church. The state legislature that year considered a slew of bills related to the Latter-day Saints, including passage of the Nauvoo Charter, incorporating the Mormon city rising on the banks of the Missouri. Oman goes on to say the church availed itself of the General Illinois Incorporation Statute. At a special conference of the church held on January the 30th, 1841, the membership voted to elect Smith as sole trustee for the church. A week later, Smith filed a certificate of incorporation with the Hancock County Clerk. In the document, Smith declared himself to have been elected the sole trustee of the church during his life and vested with plenary powers. The 1841 incorporation also gave birth to a quasi-religious office later retained in the Mormon movement, the trustee in trust. The idea of trustee in trust as a distinct office was a Mormon neologism. That's fancy talk for a new word. A truncating of the traditional conveyancing language of trusts into something new. The trustee in trust became a quasi-ecclesiastical office, designating the person with ultimate control over church assets. This can be seen, for example, in the fact that the term trustee in trust as an office or legal status never appears in American case law except in reference to the Latter-day Saints. Close quote. So now we move, as we know, as we just read there, the Saints moved from Nauvoo 1846-47, and in 1851 the legislature of the state of Deseret, the de facto government created by the Latter-day Saints upon their arrival in the Great Basin, granted the church a corporate charter that eliminated the issues that had bedeviled it for the previous 2 decades. So now we're here in what is now known as Utah. In those days, it was actually part of Mexico. And Brigham Young and other church leaders wanted to create the state of Deseret. And you can see in the little map there on the right-hand side how vast an area this encompassed. And picking up a little bit from Wikipedia on the state of Deseret, it says, quote, "The proposal for the state of Deseret encompassed nearly all of present-day Utah and Nevada, large portions of California and Arizona, and parts of Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, Idaho, and Oregon." On September the 9th, 1850, as part of the Compromise of 1850, the Utah Territory was created by Act of Congress, encompassing a portion of the northern section of Deseret. And then going back to Nathan Oman's book, he says, quote, "In 1860, the Republican Party, founded to rid the territories of the twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy, came to power. And in 1862, Congress passed the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act. In the early 1880s, Franklin S. Richards, the church's legal counsel, foreseeing that the government would move against church property, urged the creation of corporations for regional organizations called stakes and local congregations called wards to hold church assets. And so by 1887, it was relatively easy for Franklin S. Richards to fragment the legal personality of the church and scatter the bulk of its property across dozens of corporate entities. As a result, by the time the Edmunds-Tucker Act was passed in 1887, the corporate entity that it dissolved, ironically enough, owned comparatively little property. Richard's strategy paid off when the Solicitor General of the United States ruled that property held by stake and ward corporations was not subject to the Edmunds-Tucker Act. Accordingly, federal officials made no effort to move against property held by these entities. The federal receiver, however, did take control of property not held by stake or ward corporations, including, and in classic Michael Caine tones, not many people know this, including, for a brief period, the Salt Lake Temple. By the 1890s, the church had succeeded in preserving itself by adopting a reformed-style legal personality with property held in a system of decentralized congregational corporations that were under nominal lay control. Close quote. And just to comment on that by the late 1960s, jumping ahead here considerably in timeline, except where required by local law, the church had dispensed with ward and stake corporations, the final legal vestige of the Latter-day Saints' long conflict with the legacy of America's first disestablishment. Utah then became a state in 1896, and the legislature adopted a law allowing for the incorporation of religious societies. In 1901, Rulon S. Wells, a member of the church's first council of the 70, then serving in the Utah House of Representatives, introduced a bill providing for the creation of Corporations Sole, which passed unanimously. However, Franklin S. Richards, that is, Richards' thinking on this topic was continuing to develop. In 1903, almost certainly at the discreet request of the church, the Utah legislature replaced the 1901 statute with a new law governing corporations sole. By this point, Richards seems to have been thinking of providing a corporate existence above the stake and ward level. The religious officials allowed to incorporate as a corporation sole now included bishop, president, trustee in trust, and president of stake. The inclusion of the term trustee in trust is particularly telling because, as we've seen, this term was a Mormon neologism coined in Nauvoo. It is also clear, however, that the church hierarchy had not yet decided to avail itself of incorporation for the church as a whole. The evidence for this can be seen in the statute. Close quote. Moving on, with more from Nathan Oman, he says, quote, incorporating the trustee in trust as a corporation sole would eliminate the possibility of a dispute between the church and the heirs of a deceased president of the kind that had broken out upon the deaths of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. Richards, again this is Franklin S. Richards, however, inserted a provision in the law providing that in the case of a trustee in trust who, at the time of his death, was holding the title to trust property for the use of benefit of any church and not incorporated as a corporation sole, the title to any and all such property shall not revert to the donor, nor vest in the heirs of such deceased person, but shall vest in the person appointed to fill such vacancy. Close quote. So, now we jump to the 20th century. In 1916, the corporation of the presiding bishop of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was organized. 7 years later, in 1923, Richards organized the Corporation of the President of the Church, finally creating a formal legal structure for the church, completely independent of the personal identity of the hierarchy. And now we jump again, 21st century. In open quotes, in 2019, the Corporation of the President was merged into the Corporation of the Presiding Bishop, which has been renamed the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And Church President Russell M. Nelson became the new incumbent of the corporation. Thus, for the first time since 1862, there is a legal entity bearing that name. However, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a legal matter remains a corporation sole, meaning that as of 2019, it has but a single member, Church President Russell M. Nelson. This odd structure is a legacy of Mormonism's effort to find a legal structure less infected with reform ecclesiology than that which was on offer in the legal world in which it was born, close quotes. So that's a bit dense, but it's background to how the church legally was set up from 1830 onwards up until the present time. And it brings us to a question going back, in fact, to how the church was to finance itself and how it was to pay for all of its expansion and for the buildings and so forth. How would the church members finance another temple? Two revelations in 1838 introduced the law of tithing as a component of the law of consecration. After a challenging year in Kirtland, Ohio, with the Kirtland Bank situation, the debt that left Joseph Smith in particularly and others, and dissensions from the church, Joseph Smith arrived in far west Missouri in early 1838, ready to make a new start. Shortly after his arrival, he received a revelation calling for far west in Missouri to be built up as a holy city with a temple at its center. That's taken from Doctrine and Covenants, section 115. And then we come to the question of how has the law of consecration and tithing developed? So the Lord gave the law of consecration in 1831 in section 42, or it's now in section 42, in Kirtland, Ohio. And saints at that time understood the word tithing to refer to any amount of freely consecrated goods or money. So the term tithing, as it is understood by members of the church today, is different to that which it was understood back in those days in the 1830s, early 1840s. In an 1838 letter to Bishop Newell K. Whitney, Bishop Edward Partridge explained that to comply with the tithing revelations, the saints were expected to immediately consecrate to the church all surplus property and goods, meaning whatever they could not immediately use. Following that first tithing, they would then pay 10% of 6% of their net worth each year. In Nauvoo, by 1841, this practice shifted to donating 1/10 of saints' net worth at the start of the Nauvoo temple's construction, or when they joined the church, and then 10% of their increase or income each subsequent year. So initially then it was 10% of 6%. 6% was considered how much one's net worth was increasing annually. That's because the interest rates at the time were running at about 6%. The 1838 revelations taught that after consecrating their surplus property, saints should donate 1/10 of all their interest annually. Subsequent prophets re-emphasized that tithing is one means by which church members live the law of consecration. So as we consider the law of consecration, tithing is considered to be an element of it. As we know, in the 21st century, for some time before that, tithing has really been possibly the only the main element of it. Some people have asked the question, and it does come up a lot, do we need to continue to pay tithing? And this is particularly after this statement that was made in April 1907 at General Conference by the then President of the Church, Joseph F. Smith, 6th President of the Church, in fact. He says, quote, "Furthermore, I want to say to you, we may not be able to reach it right away, but we expect to see the day when we will not have to ask you for $1 of donation for any purpose, except that which you volunteer to give of your own accord, because we will have tithes sufficient in the storehouse of the Lord to pay everything that is needful for the advancement of the kingdom of God. That is the true policy, the true purpose of the Lord in the management of the affairs of his church." So a striking statement by the President of the Church, suggesting that a future day will come when the church will no longer need to call upon the tithing of the people in order to sustain itself and to move forward. And so a lot of people obviously have picked up on that and are questioning, well, why do we need to pay tithing today, particularly as we are led to believe that the church has very substantial funds in its storehouse. So a couple of comments here. I think we should just point out that, as far as I'm aware, this is the only statement or the only time such a statement was made by anybody in the church, be it a prophet or a member of the Quorum of the 12. And it is generally understood by church leaders that unless a doctrine is mentioned frequently by leading members of the church, or unless it's canonized, or unless the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 make a statement about it, unless those things happen, we ought not to put too much faith in or store in such kind of one-off comments. That, I think, is hopefully a fair summary of the position that the church adopts on kind of one-off comments. So what would happen if we stopped paying tithing? I think this is Aaron Miller. He says, if the church stopped tithing, I think it would run out of money. Those investment funds would shrink if we had a crash like 2008. Most non-profits saw their financial endowments shrink by somewhere in the order of 20% just within a year. Growth in the global south, so this is a reference to where the church is enjoying most of its growth at the moment, sub-Saharan Africa, the Far East, and Middle and South America. Growth in the global south, parts of the world where tithing payers are being heavily subsidized by the church's finances at headquarters. I believe tithing is an act of worship before it is ever an act of philanthropy. Oh, okay, so we've already seen that. Yes, it was Aaron Miller. He's a teaching professor in BYU's George Romney Institute for Public Services and Ethics. And he was answering questions on this particular subject on July the 2nd in 2023, which was when they were discussing the SEC ruling and on the occasion that the church received a fine of $5 million. Let's have a look at how church financial management has shifted with this question. In 1982, the church began using general funds for all construction throughout the world. So prior to that, whenever a building was to be built anywhere, the members were invited to contribute 50% of the cost of paying for those funds. I remember when I joined the church in 1972, each year we met with the bishop or the branch president at tithing settlement, and we would be asked what we would be able to contribute in the year ahead. Not only would we be paying our tithing and our fast offerings, but we would also be asked to contribute to the building fund of the ward, and we would be asked to contribute to the budget fund to run all of the programs in the ward. And I think we were also asked to contribute to the missionary fund, and there were maybe one or two others, I can't quite remember, but I think that was about it. But then in 1989, the first presidency announced that headquarters would henceforth pay all costs of maintaining the local meeting house, ending the budget assessments, that's what they were called, budget assessments, that local Mormons previously paid for utilities and maintenance in addition to tithing. And then in 1990, a further development removed much of the burden on families for supporting full-time missionaries. From then on, families would pay a standardized, reasonable monthly contribution, and the general church funds would pay the rest, no matter how expensive the cost of living in the missionary's location. And then we come to another huge question that a lot of people are very interested in and ask a lot. How many commercial businesses does the church own? Well, it's a very good question. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. There are so many different answers, it's difficult to know. But firstly, if we look at this is according to D. Michael Quinn, a former professor of history at BYU, in the Mormon Hierarchy, Wealth and Corporate Power, 2017, and he's talking about some research that he did back in 1983 and 1984, and he says, quote, "Of the 66 businesses I identified in 1983-84 as having general authorities as officers, directors, or trustees, financial information was available for only 1/3. Those 22 corporations had annual revenues of $14 billion, equal to $29.4 billion today, as in 2017. So you got a figure there of 66. It's not entirely clear. Well, I suppose he's saying when he says general authorities as officers, directors, or trustees, that they were fulfilling those roles as officers, directors, and trustees as part of their general authority responsibilities. I assume that's what he's saying. At the beginning of 1990, this is according to the 1992 Encyclopedia of Mormonism entry. This was entered by Stephen Douglas Naidold, an American academic, former president of Dixie State University and Weber State University. And he was also a general authority of the church. There are, quite a number. We've got Beneficial Development, Beneficial Life, Bonneville International Corporation, Deseret Book, Deseret News, Deseret Trust, Farm Management, Temple Square Hotel Corporation, Utah Home Fire Insurance Company, Zion Securities Corporation. I understand that that's now been changed to another company called UPMA. I think it's still part of the church, but it's got a different name. We'll have another look at it in a minute. And the Laie resorts in Hawaii. So there's sort of 14, 15 or so there. There's also Ag Reserve. Yeah, what does this information comes from? I don't seem to have. Oh yeah, there it goes. TTF, Truth and Transparency Foundation. This is formerly known as Mormon Leaks, so they're quite sort of well known for their investigative research, database building, and so forth. The database documents farm holdings worth at least 2.3 billion, with notably huge sections of it in Nebraska, rural Montana, Florida, Texas, and Utah. Farms, ranches, pastures, orchards, other agricultural lands under church ownership stretch horizon to horizon, with tens of thousands of contiguous acres in many cases. Then you've got a church subsidiary, called Agri Northwest, recently outbid a Bill Gates-owned company with an offer of $209 million to buy Easter Day ranch properties in eastern Washington. This is April 6, 2022 information. The working ranch included 12,000 acres of potato, onion and cattle lands, as well as valuable water rights. Though some of the food is sold commercially, it's unknown just how much of the production is income generating and how much goes towards the church's far-reaching humanitarian operations and support for members worldwide. Then you've got Farm Management Company, also referred to as Farmland Reserve Inc. by Truth and Transparency Foundation. And the claim there is that they manage commercial farms and other agricultural properties owned or leased by the church, including Deseret ranches of Florida. And they say, TTF says, the faith is now Florida's biggest landowner, controlling well over 2% of its land mass, including an enormous collection of pasture lands outside resort-rich Orlando called Deseret Ranches, and a recently acquired expanse of hundreds of thousands of forested acres in the Panhandle, Deseret Land and Livestock, Rich County, Utah, Deseret Farms of California, Rolling Hills, and so on. Farmland Reserve Inc. got Orange County Land Planning Agency approval on April 15th, 2010 for a self-contained community of 6,343 homes. That's a very large area. And then I think all of these, no, not all of them, three of the top three are in the UK. Oliver House Limited is a private company limited by shares. The principal activity of Oliver House Limited is construction of real estate. The trustees deemed it proper to acquire said company for the furtherance of one of its statutory objectives, namely the provision of buildings and facilities for religious worship. That information actually I accessed myself from the UK Charity Commission website, August 2024. Covent Garden IP Limited is a sister company which invests in UK commercial property and donates its profits to the church's charitable entities. Deseret UK Trustco Unlimited. This company appears under Note 13 Investments on the 2021 Charities Commission report. It's UK. And Property Reserve, Hawaii Reserves Inc., miscellaneous LDS church holdings in Hawaii. When combined with the Polynesian Cultural Center, the leading paid visitor attraction in Hawaii, and Brigham Young University Hawaii LDS Church related entities generated a revenue of $260 million for the Hawaii economy in 2005. There's also City Creek Reserve Inc., and this was the master developer for the City Creek Center in Salt Lake City. And from their website, the facts, the church invested about $1.5 billion to build a shopping mall. No tithing money was used, but interest from tithing money was used. Non-profit companies like the church are allowed to invest in non-profit businesses. And then finally, just two more. Suburban Land Reserve. It says these holdings are heavy in metro regions throughout the rapidly growing south and west. And they talk about one particular development. I did look this up, and I did confirm the veracity of this information. The Sunbridge development in Orange and I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Osceola counties in Florida, is a massive master planned community of 36,000 homes. Suburban Land Reserve appointed Tavistock Development Company, the creators of a previous existing development in Lake Nona, a 17 square mile master plan community in Orlando, Florida. So they appointed Tavistock Development to do the development of this area. Utah Property Management Associates, formerly Zion Securities Corporation, manages properties owned by the church primarily in the downtown area of Salt Lake City, including the ZCMI Mall, the Eagle Gate Plaza Office Tower, the Eagle Gate Apartments, the Gateway Condominiums, several other apartment buildings, and a number of parking facilities. Opened in 2001, UPMA also built the 1,700-acre Shoal Creek Valley development, a 15-minute drive from Kansas City's airport, and only 1 mile from historic Liberty, Missouri. Shoal Creek is an entire upscale master plan community. So, how many are there? Difficult to say. Probably more than 20 and probably a lot less than 60. But we don't know. It's pretty difficult to say with any certainty. The church doesn't give a great deal of information about that. Aaron Miller, again, he's the fellow from the George Romney Institute for Public Service and Ethics. And he said, and this is his view of 17 companies, Ensign Peak Advisors, which we hadn't mentioned up to now, I think, is one of 17 companies owned by the church. It's classified as a supporting organization and as an integrated auxiliary. It's regarded not only as a public charity, but as a church, and receives the same federal tax benefits. And I looked up on the 13th of August, the current market value of Ensign Peak Advisors. Ensign Peak Advisors, if for those who don't know, is the church's investment arm. And their current market value is $54 billion, and they have current holdings of 1,712 1,712 companies that they have a holding in. Now, Aaron Miller kind of responding to criticism, really, that comes of the church's what's has been considered vast wealth. And he says this, quote, "There's a lot of injustice in the world. We live in a world where we have mega billionaires, where it's not an institution serving millions of members that has wealth like this. It's one person that has wealth like that. I would encourage people to dig deeper and to understand whether or not they can know for themselves whether or not the church's resources are a reflection of that injustice, or maybe a counterbalance to it." So, interesting counterpoint, really, from Aaron Miller there to those who say that it's unjust of the church to administer such large funds when they think that the church ought to sort of be doing more with it to help. And his view really is that if you look at other heavy or very large holdings by individuals, the church is doing sort of a different thing than they are doing. Okay, now why did the SEC fine the church and EPA, Ensign Peak Advisors? Unanimous approval from church. Okay, so this is one paragraph from the SEC's findings, which they produced on February the 21st, 2023. And if you want to look into it in much more detail, there is an awful lot of detail there. There's about 40 different facts, or the SEC refer to these as facts, as part of their overall finding. And so the background here is that the Ensign Peak Advisors has to submit a return every quarter to the SEC, and they have to show how much the total value is of their fund holdings, and whether in what they're being held and what companies they're being held and so forth. And as the fund got larger and larger, the church took the decision, or Ensign Peak Advisors took the decision, to separate the holdings into what they call, they're companies they're kind of shell companies that are set up for that purpose. And there's nothing wrong in doing that. Had they done that and that alone, that would have probably not come to the notice of the SEC. But what they didn't do is, and what they were supposed to do is, when they filed their returns, they were supposed to allow each of these shell companies, 13 shell companies that were set up around the country, each of them to actually manage a proportion of the total funds that they had. And it became clear to the SEC that Ensign Peak Advisors was actually managing all of the funds, and that the fund managers at the 13 various shell companies were there really in name only. And that was what upset the SEC. And of course, as you know from the church's statement, that the church said that they were following the legal advice that they had received. And so this is just one little extract from these sort of 30 to 40 factual statements from the SEC's ruling. Throughout its history, at least once each year, Ensign Peak's managing director met with senior leadership of the church to discuss Ensign Peak's activities, including at times this kind of shell company structure. Unanimous approval from the senior leadership of the church was required before Ensign Peak could deviate from that structure and file Forms 13F in Ensign Peak's own name. Ensign Peak, and this is the fines, Ensign Peak shall, within 10 days of the entry, blah, 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 pay the amount of $4 million, and the church shall, within 10 days, pay $1 million. So that's why the SEC fined the church and the EPA. What did the whistleblower say? Okay, so this goes back to 2019. This is Lars and David Nielsen, who were working at that time for Ensign Peak Advisors. And they wrote to the IRS and basically said, you ought to look at what's going on here at EPA, because the money isn't being used in perhaps the way you think it is being used, Mr. IRS. And this was basically the nub of it. Quote, the Corporation of the President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints gives Ensign Peak Advisors the reserve of the reserves, between $1 and $2 billion each year. EPA's investment income is currently $7 billion per year. EPA has received around $20 billion in tax breaks from the American public over the past 22 years. However, it has never spent $1 on anything religious, educational, or charitable, despite now having more than $100 billion in highly liquid, non-real estate assets. EPA allegedly has made 2 unlawful distributions to bail out Beneficial Financial Group and to build the City Creek Mall using 100% never invested tithing surplus. Public statements by Mormon leaders reveal a sustained intent to deceive the public, the membership, and the IRS about its size and use of funds. And they're their names, Lars and David Nielsen. They approximated at that time the total assets of the COP, Corporation of the President, at $124 billion. That was back in 2019. And so just to that this may be an ongoing situation that hasn't actually been totally resolved, but so far, and this is like 5 years later, we're now in 2024 when we're doing this, so far the IRS has not felt disposed to say anything public about this. I guess no one knows what it might be doing in the background, but a lot of people commented at the time and since that they don't think that this is something that the IRS is likely to take much notice of. Why did James Huntsman sue the church? Another question. A whistleblower's report from former Ensign Peak Advisors employee David Nielsen claimed tithing was spent on City Creek. That claim became the basis for a lawsuit from former member James Huntsman. Who is James Huntsman? Well, he is the son of a very prominent family, Utah family. His father, John Huntsman, started Huntsman Chemicals, I think it's called, a huge company. And obviously they, as a family, contributed significant funds to the church over a long time. And James, he filed his lawsuit on March 22nd, 2021. Huntsman's lawsuit was dismissed by a federal court on September the 10th, 2021. The judge ruled there was a difference between tithing and funds from invested tithing. So the judge made the distinction because President Hinckley, as you probably recall, said in General Conference, no tithing funds were used to build City Creek Mall. But they used the funds from Ensign Peak Advisors, which is made up of the surplus tithing funds. The judge ruled there was a difference between tithing and funds from invested tithing and found the church committed no fraud in the funding of City Creek. A very up-to-date look at that, though, it does say after a divided panel of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals granted Huntsman relief, the church asked the full court to rehear the case. On October the 2nd, 2023, Beckett filed, Beckett is a law company. Beckett filed a friend of the court brief at the Ninth Circuit in support of rehearing, arguing that the law protects the freedom of religious groups to make faith-based decisions without court interference. The court has now agreed to rehear the case in September 2024. So there's a bit of an ongoing situation there as well. Here's another question. How can the church be a non-profit? The church and who's this from? This is from Sam Brunson. He's a law professor at Loyola University Chicago. He says, quote, the Mormon church has a lot of billions of dollars and it makes money on its investments. How then could it possibly be a non-profit? Non-profits can make profits. Well, largely it's because non-profits can make a profit. Now, stick with me here. This isn't some kind of paradox. See, the idea underlying non-profits and tax-exempt organizations, for that matter, isn't that they can't earn a profit, it's that they can't distribute that profit to insiders or share it with identifiable individuals. Two critical things to point out here. The first is paying a salary is not the same as distributing profits. Second, as long as they don't share their profits, non-profits can earn a lot of money. Another question, should the church have tax exempt status? Again, this is Sam Brunson. He says, quote, the Internal Revenue Code lays out 8 or I guess 9, depending on how you pass them, purposes that tax exempt organizations can pursue. Religious, charitable, scientific, testing for public safety, literary, educational purposes, to foster national, international amateur sports competition, but only if no part of its activities involve the provision of athletic facilities or equipment, or for the prevention of cruelty to children or animals. And he goes on to say that the Supreme Court has looked at the whole situation of churches and their tax-exempt status. The Supreme Court declined to bring the idea of poor relief into the definition because different churches do different amounts of it. The government telling a church what its religious obligations are would implicate the First Amendment's religion clauses. And then what does the church say in answer to some of these questions and some of these situations, criticisms that have come? This is Bishop Christopher Wardell. He's a counsellor in the presiding bishopric. He says, quote, when we talk about preparing for the second coming, that doesn't mean we're hoarding money so that we have it when the second coming takes place. In preparing for the second coming, we're talking about building temples and providing places of worship and temples where people can receive sacred and exalting ordinances so we can gather Israel, we can do the missionary work in preparation for that day. And so when we talk about preparing for it, that means all the work that's going on. This is Elder Bednar. He's sort of explaining about how, where the money goes, as it were, to an extent. He says 399 missions and the travel and healthcare expenses of 67,695 missionaries. The church has 5 universities and colleges which educate 90,000 students, operate at a cost of 1.5 billion a year, paid for by tuition and tithing. It pays, i.e., the church pays for a seminary and institutes program that provides religious education to more than 800,000 teens and college students around the world. The effort includes 50,000 teachers. The church operates 27 wheat storage facilities and funds 9 refugee resettlement agencies in the United States. It also operates more than 100 bishops' storehouses full of food and commodities to help church members around the world. The church spent more, he goes on to say, quote, the church spent more than 1 billion last year subsidizing tuition, providing other financial support at Brigham Young University, BYU, Idaho, BYU, Hawaii, Ensign College, and BYU Pathway Worldwide. He says, quote, I want to make one other comment about this. People want to bang on the church and say, well, you've got all that money in reserve. Yeah, and it's a good idea for other people to follow that example. We believe that you can read in the Old Testament about 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty. It's a good idea to prepare. These undertakings that I've described are resource consuming, not resource generating. And a lot of people depend on the resource that we provide. And if things are different in the future than they are now, we think it's provident and wise to prepare to maintain that kind of support in an uncertain economic environment. So I think there's a bit of repetition on the bottom of that slide where he's giving pretty much the same information that I think we've already covered. He goes on to say, and now this is at a National Press Club in Washington, D.C. in May 26, 2022, we have the largest global collection of records from over 190 countries and territories and an average of 1.2 million visits on FamilySearch.org every day. Genealogical enthusiasts may access those records for free at one of more than 5,400 Family Search centers around the world and at our Family Search library in Salt Lake City. More than half of those who visit these satellite libraries are not members of our faith. And he says, quote, we also host an annual gathering of family history enthusiasts called Rootstech. This global conference is provided free of charge online. This year, more than 1,500 class sessions were provided to more than 3.1 million participants to help people of all ages discover their ancestors, share their memories, and make meaningful connections. So that brings it really to a close. It's kind of been a bit dense and it's gone on for a bit longer than I had anticipated this evening. Thank you to those who have sent in questions. If you have a question that you would like addressed, please send it to Church History Insights and Questions, or Chiq, 1830 at gmail.com. And we'll have a look at any questions that you send in. Thanks very much for your time, and look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you. Bye-bye.